Great. So we're going to tag team this a little bit, and I'll start.
Yeah, and we share a birthday and a bald spot, so that should be
not necessarily in that order.
No.
Yeah. Let me tell you a little bit. I'll start by telling you a little bit about why we wrote the book. For me, the story of how business has become engaged in the world's biggest challenges is one of the most interesting and one of the most important changes that we've seen in our world in the last 25 years. With the fall of the Berlin Wall, the rise of market economies, the decline in faith in governments, business really took center stage. And in the 1990s, that combined with digital communications really changed the equation along with the rise of NGOs. And so businesses began to look at issues that heretofore had been the province of governments or advocacy groups like human rights, like climate change, et cetera, et cetera. And while a lot of this agenda began to arise based on moral and ethical arguments, we've tried to write a book that would actually put those things, important as they are, off to the side and say that actually there's a fundamental change in the way businesses think about their place in the world, and that the companies that get that right are the ones that are best positioned to succeed and compete. If you look back at economic history, at any time of serious change and dislocation, the companies that get ahead of that and continue to innovate, and in the words of one of the people we spoke to for the book, quote, chase the disruption, those tend to be the companies that come out of these areas of great change as the new champions. And for us, sustainability is one of the distinguishing characteristics, if not the distinguishing characteristic, that will separate winners from losers as we go through a more global, a more integrated, a more transparent, and a more resource-constrained world, in a world where power and influence is decentralized, if not utterly fragmented. So that then led us to the title of our book, Sustainable Excellence, and it's a double or triple entendre, I'm not sure which, but our view is that companies can't be sustainable unless they think about social and environmental questions with the same commitment to excellence that they apply to marketing and product development, et cetera. And companies can't achieve excellence unless they think about sustainability, and in fact, marrying the two helps companies to sustain excellence. And we know that there's no guarantee that companies survive periods of great change. I didn't fly in on Pan Am. I didn't buy my suit at Woolworths. There are a lot of companies that have failed to see change, failed to get ahead of it, and we tried to write a book that would present a cold-eyed view, in a sense, of how companies can do exactly that, and some stories about how companies are fundamentally remaking their strategies in order to prepare themselves for this period of disjunctive change that presents huge opportunity, markets opening up with a speed and a volume that we've never seen before, but also the potential that the economy will just run into a brick wall if trust is lost, if natural resources aren't available, if protectionism rises such that markets start to shut down. Those are all things that will prevent some of the economic growth that, of course, companies are most interested in, that also present an opportunity for the most widely shared prosperity, quite frankly, the planet's ever known. So we hope that the book is a bit of a roadmap and a clear-eyed roadmap to help companies understand just what it takes to win and contribute in the world that's changing so quickly.
So just to highlight some of that, we thought about these issues in terms of where business and society has been and where it currently is, and of course where we hope and think it may be going. And I think both of us were struck by him, and Aron more so than me, because he's been deeply immersed in these issues for longer than I have, and I came at this more as a money manager and also an historian, a combination that I know is widely shared and ubiquitous. But what was striking was that issues of environment and labor and rights and transparency, all of which in the 70s and 80s were seen as externalities to the corporation and externalities to the C-suite, and things that, as Aron said, NGOs or advocacy groups attempted to put pressure on companies to pay attention to. And all these issues that were seen, for better and often for worse, as peripheral to the core mission of a company of returning value to shareholders, have become utterly central and integrated into the core operating mission of companies in an astonishingly short amount of time. Really, in the past, probably 5 to 7 years, has this stuff really become deeply integrated into the core of corporate missions. And it's startling to see that, particularly in light of both the past and the recent past. Again, if you had thought about these issues in the 70s, you would have thought about them largely from the same movement that was opposing the Vietnam War, or the bi-coastal movements of ecology and a certain antipathy towards big business and government as sources of harm on the global ecosystem and not sources of potential. And even those companies that developed early on as kind of exemplars of integrating this suite of sustainability concerns into their core, companies like Ben & Jerry's or Stonyfield Farms or The Body Shop or Patagonia were unique in that mission, but not particularly determinate in setting an agenda for global business. They were more, new ideas. And one of the ironies / intriguing signs of how these things have changed is that almost all of those, with the exception of Patagonia, have now been bought by larger multinational companies and have begun to integrate their ideas into them. Stonyfield being bought by Danone being one of the more notable ones. And I think most of America became conscious of some of these issues at some inflection point in the middle 2000s, both with Al Gore's film An Inconvenient Truth and some sort of global turning point of people's awareness of climate change and how that affected business. And then you had General Electric very famously introducing this Eco-Imagination campaign. And there were these moments in time, 2006 in particular, where it seemed to be very zeitgeisty. What's interesting about the present is that, Aron and I conceived of this book as a book. I mean, we've both been focusing on these issues in the fall of 2008 when we were in the Persian Gulf, oddly enough, trying to do a project for the Emirate of Dubai, which had, before the financial implosion, decided that amongst its other goals for being an icon of a new global economy was that it was going to become the most sustainable city-state in the world by 2015, notwithstanding the fact that there were also ski lifts being built in the middle of the desert. And we were also potentially doing a project for Masdar, which is an arm of the Abu Dhabi government, which is spending $30 to $50 billion over the next 5 years of oil money to build a carbon-neutral city. And when it became clear that Dubai was probably had greater concerns in its next 5 years than its sustainability report for 2015, we thought about doing the book. And what was striking is that it would have been easy from that vantage point to imagine that one of the results of the financial crisis would have been for companies to radically pare back their commitment to this suite of issues that we loosely define as sustainability. And what's really striking is how much they have, if anything, doubled down their efforts, not necessarily their spending, but their strategy and their attention to these efforts, because of the degree to which ideas of sustainability and efficiencies and productivities and transparency and labor have become so key to operating effectively in a world of rising input costs and reduced growth that, far from being banished to the side as external things that you can afford in flush times but cut in lean times, they have become the kind of core component of future strategy that companies have basically become more committed to as a result of the financial crisis. And that's not something I think we would have predicted given our sense of the history. And I think it says just how key these issues have become, even if companies don't think of them in terms of the words sustainability or sustainable excellence, which we coined, and therefore no one yet thinks about it necessarily in those terms, although we're planning on everyone, and we tried to trademark it and copyright it and all these things, but apparently we can't gain any income if a corporation decides to institute a policy of sustainable excellence. But I mean, that's a whole separate issue. But the degree to which companies have really redoubled their efforts in the financial crisis is striking, and have made it a core to strategy, which Aron has certainly focused on quite a bit.
I mean, what's interesting is, as you live through periods of history, sometimes the public policymakers draw one lesson, and it's another lesson that ends up being the more enduring one. And I think something along those lines has happened over the past few years, because in our work at BSR, working with companies, the evident economic vulnerability, unemployment, et cetera, is weak demand is obviously present. But the message that I think really got through in the C-suite was in the run-up to the recession, when commodity prices spiked. Let's remember $147 a barrel oil, wheat prices, copper prices, you name it, at historic highs. And what happened, therefore, was a lot of companies said the resource crunch that we knew was coming, that a lot of people told us was coming because of rising demand from big emerging economies, it's here, and this is the new reality. This is going to prove, in my view, to be a lot more lasting than the weakness that we're experiencing. I mean, we may go through in the West a decade of low growth. That may be the case, but we will have half a century of pressure on natural resource prices. And so this is how companies are thinking about it, and I think it's the main reason why companies have not only maintained, but in fact extended their commitments over the last 2 or 3 years, when cutbacks have been, companies by and large have been cutting their way to strong profit margins. But this has been an area that's been virtually ring-fenced, actually. And you see, even today, a company like Unilever pledging to double its growth in the coming 10 years while cutting in half, in absolute terms, the natural resources it uses to do that. That's a very significant commitment, public commitment, et cetera, et cetera. So I think there's been a sea change in thinking, and what this means is that companies are taking a much more strategic approach, and at times almost reimagining the very businesses that they're in. And in the book we tell a couple of stories, and well, several actually, but a couple to tell here. A company like Best Buy, which is known for its distinctive blue stores, for being a playground for kids like mine who love to run around in there and then ask me how much they can buy, and the Geek Squad. And Best Buy is looking to reimagine the Geek Squad as essentially a 21st century version of Mr. Goodwrench, as they're trying to get into e-bikes, because they see the ability to move into new forms of electronics, whether it's e-bikes or energy management systems for the home that deal with urban gridlock, that deal with rising energy prices. And they're taking the assets that they've got, like the Geek Squad, like their ability to help and install home entertainment management systems, to apply to a whole different suite of issues. And they're going to reconfigure some of their stores to make the service bays essentially e-bike repair shops, et cetera, et cetera. So the smart companies are indeed taking this concept of chasing the disruption, which I mentioned earlier, and applying that to their strategies and remaking them before the world remakes their strategies for them. And Detroit is the best cautionary tale I can think of, as not only as an example of an entire industry that showed that bee colonies are not the only thing that can collapse overnight. Entire industries can, because some of these pent-up trends that seem almost subterranean erupt into consciousness and into the economy all at once, and companies that aren't prepared for that don't have an answer, and that's what we saw in Detroit. We actually tell the story of Ford, which had a better response to that than its two peers in Detroit, and it emerged much more unscathed than Chrysler or GM. And the reason was that they were thinking ahead, that their chairman, Bill Ford, had a vision of the future that saw Ford's future looking not only at the sale of private cars, the very thing that Henry Ford was known for, but also trying to find a way into public transport systems, into car sharing, to new models of transportation that were not just dependent on the kind of model that made sense in 1946, when the American suburb was the dominant model in the world, but made sense for a 21st century world when you have more than half the world's people living in cities, most of them as gridlocked as LA, and in fact worse. And so the companies that have gotten ahead of that have changed their strategies, adapted their strategies, and this is no longer a question of having a sustainability official off in the corner you can trot out to talk to NGOs. This is a question of what the board of directors is thinking about. This is a question of the bet that a company, that a CEO wants wants to place in terms of where his company is going. That's a fundamental change. That's happened much more recently, as Zachary says, really in the last 5 or 6 years, and it's showing the steady maturation of this whole dialogue, and I think a greater seriousness of purpose on the part of a lot of companies.
You know, we do talk about Ford in the book as an example, and among other companies, it's also something that we try to apply, that the search for the perfect company and the perfect organization that has embraced sustainability as strategy, embraced the notion of resource constraints and how to be more efficient, and imbibed an ethos of doing well and doing good, profiting for both their own internal organization, the future of the planet. That may be a lovely ideal, but the reality is we live in a real world composed of human organizations, many of which are complicated and most of which are flawed. And so Ford, while they were both articulating a vision of a transportation future that involves solutions far beyond the internal combustion engine, has certainly survived the crisis by making more effective internal combustion engines at a better price point, and then opposing a free trade deal with South Korea because of concerns about competition that may inhibit its ability to make SUVs. So, and we talk a lot about BP, which is clearly one of the most dramatic and one of the most resonant examples of a company that both articulated a genuine vision of a beyond petroleum future, and it was more than just a marketing slogan. I mean, it's very easy now to lambaste BP for the disconnect between its marketing slogan and its safety issues in the oil spill. But as Aron knows quite intimately, working with Shell as well, it was far more than that when Lord Browne discussed this, about potentially helping a petroleum-based, carbon-based energy company transform itself into a solution for the energy needs of the world that was not simply based on oil or gas even. You know, back to this idea of what the pressures of sustainability have created within companies is, if necessity is the mother of invention, then in many ways scarcity has been the mother of innovation. And this resource crunch, which has continued almost unabated except for a brief period from September of 2008 until March of 2009, when commodity prices collapsed, when the world was sort of unclear about the directionality of the global economy. And then those prices returned with a vengeance. Because the reality is, financial crisis notwithstanding, this is the greatest period of wealth creation and middle class emergence that the planet has ever seen, at a pace and a speed that none of us could look back in history and find has happened before. And that's placing this huge call on natural resources, of which that call will not be met. Meaning there is more demand for a middle-class lifestyle a la the Western world in the emerging world than the planet under current technological and resource realities could possibly satisfy. And that is creating an innovation spur for companies, both to think about how they do what they do more effectively and more efficiently, whether that's the utilization of labor or the transmission of information or the utilization of technology, or simply figuring out how to draw less from the environment in order to have more future. It's also created an innovation spur to think in terms of the malleability of products. And we have a chapter in the book called "It's the Product Stupid," about the ways in which companies are, the successful, sustainable companies will be the ones that define themselves by the need they satisfy and not necessarily the product they make. And there's an old marketing canard of, nobody is looking for a quarter-inch screw. They are looking for a quarter-inch hole. And if you can provide them with that need, they will be agnostic about the product. And a lot of companies, whether it's Clorox reconceiving of what exactly is it providing, what does cleaning material mean, in what degree, or a company like Ford potentially rethinking of a transportation future, that the imperatives of this world and sustainability means that you become more focused on that which you're providing people and not necessarily the product itself, and it becomes an innovation spur. I mean, Aron has done a lot of work with Nike around this, and maybe you want to use that as a jumping off point from that.
And Nike is a fascinating case because Nike really represents the entirety of this modern era of corporate responsibility or sustainability. And of course, Nike made its debut on the stage in this area in the mid to late 90s, when, by the admission of Phil Knight, the brilliant, somewhat reclusive and somewhat eccentric founder of the company, admitted at the Washington Press Club, his company had become the poster child for all the evils of globalization. And ask any 16-year-old from 1997 what they thought. Nike's polling showed that the customers they were most interested in were souring on this company very, very quickly. And so Nike very quickly and very rationally responded to this crisis by trying to manage risk. And they tried to mitigate risk by putting in place a whole set of compliance means, very well-intentioned. They accomplished many things, and they ultimately found that they didn't work, and they didn't work for two reasons. One is that it doesn't really make sense for Nike essentially to have labor law enforcement outsourced to the private sector. That's not a model that is effective social policy. It's not what companies want to do. So they've done a lot of it, as have lots and lots of other companies, but it's not really, no pun intended, a sustainable model. The other reason is more interesting, though. What Nike finally realized is that it's a company that thrives on creativity and innovation. As someone said to us in writing the book, we're a company that's really good when we're on offense. We're not very good at playing defense. I don't think they sell a lot of shoes with that motto, but they're supposed to be good for both. But they're not good at playing defense. They like to create. Mark Parker, the CEO, is a shoe designer. That's how he cut his teeth. That's how he rose over the last 30 years at Nike. And so what he's done is he's basically thrown down the challenge to their design team to say, just like performance, just like innovation and design is important, so is sustainability. So the design brief for every new shoe at Nike, every product they make, it has sustainability as one of the attributes they're trying to create. He's now got the company operating with the wind at its back, in a sense, and so they come up with some really innovative solutions. The jerseys that all the World Cup soccer teams wore this year were made out of plastic water bottles. About 400,000 bottles were transformed into jerseys. Now that's a great environmental story, but what got Nike excited is these were the lightest, fastest cooling jerseys they had ever produced. They took a step change up in innovation by thinking about a new product and thinking about how they could really bake sustainability into it. Now, they don't sell these jerseys based on their being green. They base them on the fact that they perform really well, and that's how they try to communicate with the consumer. So what you have here is an example of a company that was, in a sense, trying to be something that it wasn't, a labor policeman. And they were moderately successful. They invested a lot of resources in doing that. They slowly began to repair their image, et cetera, but they've really taken off when they've said, what is it that we do as a company, and how can we think about the role sustainability plays, and how can sustainability be a catalyst for innovation, because ultimately that's what Nike is all about. And they're now doing all sorts of fascinating things, whereas once they were in dialogue with a lot of local labor organizations, and they actually still are. Now they get involved with NASA, as NASA's looking at lightweight materials that they need to develop and that they are developing, and they're really interested in innovation. So you see these kinds of unlikely partnerships emerging, and they make sense because both Nike and NASA, believe it or not, are really interested in innovation, really concerned about sustainability. So they've got common cause, and they're building the kinds of partnerships that help them really make the kind of progress they couldn't make on their own. So this synergy between the core essence of what a company is and sustainability thinking, this too is something that's beginning to emerge, I think creates a lot of really great potential.
And this idea of pragmatism driving a lot of these solutions, I mean, in some sense we took as a given where we came from in this, which is, we think on the whole it's better for a company to think about its mission X, its returning value to shareholders, if that were, an ideal that could be realized. And it would be great if companies thought that the environment was important and that labor was meaningful. But the pragmatism part of it is that the way companies are currently structured, while that can be embraced within a corporate mission, it's not going to be a winning argument necessarily within a corporate mission, and that there has to be some sort of, they're tethering to some sort of bottom line rationale in order to drive that effectively through an organization. And that this particular moment where sustainability a la Nike is wedded to innovation and therefore wedded to great products has been this kind of unusual moment opened up in the past few years particularly in light of the fact that governments globally seem unable to deal with a lot of these issues. So, waiting on governments to come up with the next generation of guidelines about sustainable and emissions and all of that, or the United States to come up with guidelines around carbon, we will be waiting for a long time for that clarity. And companies are not going to sit and wait for that clarity in order to keep moving ahead in whatever their corporate mission is, which is to create products and services that are tractable and competitive. And companies have been doing exactly that in spite of the log jams in these other areas, and in spite of the fact that we don't believe that companies have suddenly become moral animals, right? Nor do they have to in order to achieve many of these things. Now, there is one aspect of this that, to be fair, of some companies are just in easier industries than others, right? Nike's kind of in the middle. They use a lot of resources. They have to be innovative. Clorox, which we write about, and how do you integrate first a green line of cleaning materials in a way that consumers will find appealing and also clean clothes. Some companies have it rather easy, and they tend to be the ones that have often been the most symbolic of these visions and movements, and that's technology companies. I mean, the reality is Google can be extremely visionary about sustainability, although oddly enough, when we talk to Eric Schmidt, it's not a word, sustainability, that he really thinks about. He may think about the content of that word, of energy effectiveness, communications, transparency, but he doesn't think about that word. He thinks about the nuts and bolts of it. But frankly, it's easier for Google. Google's environmental impact are the heat that its servers give off, which is considerable, but is a pittance compared to the amount of rubber that Nike needs to use, or would have needed to use before it recycled water bottles. And both are a pittance compared to a mining company or to British Petroleum. And that all of these companies inhabit an ecosystem that we all inhabit. And that it is, you cannot have a one-size-fit-all solution because different industries and different companies are embedded in different aspects of the sustainability chain. And to expect that one solution will fit Google and also fit Shell isn't quite the point. We didn't try to create a sustainable excellence template that could then be just stamped on any company irrespective, in part because those differences make it different. But as a driver of good management and of excellence and of how to function in the world, that crosses over industry lines and industry borders. But we do address the conundrum of commodities. We also address the problem of finance in all of this, right? There's a lot of money in Wall Street and institutional managers, particularly in California, for CalPERS and CalSTRS, some of the largest pension plans in the world, about wanting that money to go toward a more sustainable future. And then the problem is, well, how do you make sure that that money goes toward a more sustainable future without sacrificing return? And the result is there's not a lot of money that goes towards this. There's a lot of talk of money being committed toward these things. But even then, we look at companies that have seen opportunity for future growth, like KKR, Kohlberg Kravis Roberts, like Texas Pacific, which did a huge deal for the Texas utilities a number of years ago and worked with environmental defense. A very odd pairing, where environmental defense worked with Goldman Sachs and Texas Pacific to do a major power plant deal of TCU in Texas to reduce the number of coal plants that would be built in the future. And that kind of allegiance of companies and NGOs is also an unusual and growing development. And Aron has been right at the center of that NGO company axis, which is morphing very quickly and is leading to some unusual partnerships.
Well, it is, and having been in the middle, I have the track marks on my back at times from being in between some unlikely partners. But some of the things that would have been considered completely taboo or unlikely 15, 20 years ago have become very much commonplace. So when you think about centers of where NGOs have their base and so on, you don't necessarily think of Bentonville, Arkansas. Well, the Environmental Defense Fund has an office in Bentonville, Arkansas. No one would have predicted this. Many of you probably know why Bentonville, Arkansas is where EDF is, and it's not because they like the University of Arkansas's football team. It's because that's where Walmart is. And Walmart has developed the kind of relationship with this NGO that used to be about suing or challenging companies publicly. They've created a partnership such that EDF has set up an office in Bentonville. These are things that would have been completely unheard of not that long ago, and now people don't really bat an eye. One of the stories we tell in the book is about a partnership between Coca-Cola and Greenpeace. And Greenpeace in Germany discovered that there was a manufacturing plant in the former East Germany that had very good ability to produce solid refrigeration equipment. And Greenpeace is very interested in reducing the carbon and carbon that's produced in electricity that's needed for refrigeration. Well, long story short, they brought this technology, they refined it a bit, they took it to Coca-Cola. They asked Coca-Cola to create refrigeration units because that's one of the biggest elements of Coca-Cola's footprint. Coca-Cola has to keep a lot of beverage cold around the world every day. And they developed, actually, a partnership to refine this. And long story short, at the Beijing Olympics in 2008, these new low-impact refrigeration units were everywhere, and now they're used all over the world. The notion that Coca-Cola and Greenpeace would have been partners in product development, I think, is laughable. It's one of those things that you just don't predict. You don't think of that kind of relationship. You don't think of Greenpeace as an organization that is producing a better refrigerator. But lo and behold, all sorts of unlikely alliances are being created. And Zachary talked about how we don't sit back and wait for governments. And if the 20th century was about big business producing goods and employing people, big government setting laws, collecting taxes and enforcing laws, and big media, back when there were big and a small number of media reporting on it, that world, of course, is gone. And you get sort of this kaleidoscopic world where you shift, and each time you shift, you see a different configuration of actors. And as a matter of social policy, it's tricky. Tom Friedman gave a quote in a speech I heard him give 10 years ago, which was quite good, that during the Cold War, no one had power, but you knew who was in charge. And in today's world, everyone has power and no one's in charge. And I think that's absolutely true, and that's why you see this really diverse set of relationships. Now, it's complicated for companies because Greenpeace, despite its moonlighting as a refrigerator manufacturer, it still does campaigns. And earlier this year, Nestle had a bit of an ugly wake-up call when Greenpeace produced at very low cost a mock commercial showing an office worker opening a Kit Kat bar. Nestle makes Kit Kat, and Kit Kat bar includes palm oil. Well, this office worker had his afternoon snack, opened up the Kit Kat bar. It was not chocolate that he found, but an orangutan's finger. He bit into it, blood ensues, and that's really as far as I need to go with that. It's quite grisly, quite grisly. And this video cost virtually nothing to make. It had 200,000 views within a very short period of time. No media buy involved here because it went up on YouTube. And so here you've got Greenpeace, which on the one hand is partnering with Coca-Cola, on the other hand dragging Nestle through the mud, or maybe more appropriately through the blood, because the palm oil that is in this ingredient is widely believed to be responsible for the deforestation of the natural habitat of the orangutan in Southeast Asia. So Greenpeace hijacked the brand that Nestle had invested a lot of time and money in building, and it took this very negative portrayal viral in a very short period of time. No big media, no big NGO, but no big investment here, and big brand suffers a big injury. So it's a very dynamic and fast-changing environment out there. Companies find great promise and great peril in all of this. And managing that well is something that some companies have learned very well, and some companies, unfortunately, have had to learn the hard way.
Yeah, and when it comes to big business, it's really the realization that one aspect of sustainability today is that what you do anywhere, you do everywhere. And there's no such thing as a large company developing a social responsible conscience or practice because that's good for business in one environment in one country, and then not being either shamed, embarrassed, or forced to adopt those practices in another. Because the disconnect is evident, and it will be exposed. So you can't just say, oh, we're going to help communities in one part of our operations and ignore them in another. And the same thing being brand is global. You can't really rely on total local building of brand anymore. One aspect of this that we didn't talk about as much, but we do talk about in the book, but this highlights, is that this is not just a European or American phenomenon, nor is it confined to companies that have, at least nominally, their domicile in the United States or Europe. This is a global development that, oddly enough, is now attracting the adamant participation of players that you wouldn't have expected, whether it's state-owned enterprises in China, like China Mobile, thinking hard and fast about its labor relations in a sort of post-pseudo-communist world. It's South Africa setting stringent conditions for the listing of companies, including transparency of a whole series of sustainability criteria in order to just list on the South African Stock Exchange. It's a whole Brazilian ethos of how business is being done that's infecting a lot of their larger companies, many of which are resource companies, about a more sustainable utilization of natural resources. So there is a global element here of Indian companies making poverty alleviation central to their mission, because there's a deep self-interest in doing so, because unless you alleviate poverty in rural India, you don't create domestic markets in India for those companies to then sell into. So none of this is just altruistic if altruism is defined as that which is without self-interest. All of it is positive, productive, because it marries those self-interests with sustainability. So we do very much talk about the global dimension. It's not always coming with the same language, but it is very much happening in multiple areas of the world simultaneously, feeding off of each other, but simultaneously. And we try to end the book with a sense of what the future is going to bring. And I'll let Aron talk about the conclusions of that. One just aspect of that does embed our narrative, which is we are on balance positive about the ability of businesses to meaningfully contribute to a more sustainable future, even with a host of negatives having to do with we still live in a very intensive resource economy. We live in a world of governments having, at best, a complicated time working in sync with one another, and zero-sum mentalities are certainly pervasive globally. But that the imperatives of the marketplace, the rise of resource prices, the need for efficiencies, the globalization of business, all of these have combined and conspired in a very short amount of time to create a lot of positive momentum, if simply toward a direction where the material needs of the planet can be met in a way that is sustainable for generations. We don't know if that's going to happen, but we do see the signs of that happening with an energy and aggressiveness coming out of companies globally that you do not see in government, and you don't necessarily even see in individuals. And that is an unexpectedly hopeful note in what is otherwise still a somewhat complicated and not so hopeful time, particularly in the Western world.
So I will just briefly give an overview of how we end the book, not to ruin the suspense, because I hope you read it all.
It's a real page-turner.
It is.
Yeah.
It's a potboiler. But this is set up for a sequel, so we do leave a few things hanging. Actually, speaking of a sequel, we talk about the fact that, in our view, this is the trajectory. If someone were to ask us 10 years from now, in 2020, to write a follow-up to this book, the title, Sustainable Excellence, might cause people to be a bit quizzical, say, well, actually, isn't what you're talking about just basic excellence? Isn't this just what a company needs to do to survive and thrive in a world where all of the things that we've talked about this afternoon are indeed the determining factor of how well a company creates products and services, communicates with the public, earns the trust and maintains its reputation, attracts the best possible people, attracts capital, and also has access to natural resources. And we believe that that's the case. That's the trajectory. Will we be there in 2020? I'd like to think we will. I'm an optimist by nature, but I think the arc may be a bit longer than that, but the direction is absolutely clear. And this is indeed the future of business, as the subtitle says, and as Zachary said very well, it's also the kind of future of the world that we all, I think, hope to build. So we'd love to take some questions, comments, challenges. I think there are mics that are going to be circulating. So
thank you guys very much. We'll pause. I recognize a lot of faces, but if you haven't been here before, we ask that you not ask a question unless you have the microphone, which we'll bring to you. So just raise your hand. Please, one question, not multiple questions, and no long statements. We want to give everybody a chance to respond. So we'll start right here with this gentleman.
Have you done any correlation analysis between stock price trajectory and strength of commitment to sustainability?
So there have been those analyses done. One was done by a group called Innovest, which doesn't exist as an independent entity anymore and has been bought by several larger companies since. The short answer is yes, some of those studies have been done, and yes, they all show that the stock price and the performance of the company is favorably correlated with whatever metrics of sustainability you choose to input. But I have to say, as somebody who both manages a fund focused on sustainability and created another one a few years ago, that I'm wary of those because it's such a limited amount of time that anyone's even been paying attention to these variables. You can pick and choose the variables and then retroactively impose them on companies. And like most backtesting that's new, you can kind of create the answer you want to create. So if you ask me to prove that there is a connection between these issues and stock price performance, I absolutely can prove it. But that doesn't mean that I'm buying it. What I am buying is that there is a degree to which efficiencies and companies that are thinking in a both paranoid and constructively creative fashion about the future and what they will or will not be able to do have over time proven to be simply more competitive and more viable entities. And that there is no question that being more efficient and more transparent in a world like we just described with Nestle and Greenpeace, all of these things can reduce the frictional cost of doing business, which we can hope in time is reflected in stock price, will certainly be reflected in a company's profitability and in their ability to continue to be a viable business. But I wouldn't right now, because these are such a recent suite of issues, overdo it with the quantitative, because I think the quantitative is much more easily massageable than the outcomes that these companies are currently demonstrating.
There's another way to come at this question also, which is that a number of governments and a number of securities regulators are now changing listing rules to encourage or mandate very explicitly companies to consider medium to long-term risk related to this set of issues, because there's a clear understanding that failing to do so is yet another risk factor that's been overlooked or ignored over the last 20, 25 years. And I won't bore you with the examples of that. There are lots of them. But I think this is going to be institutionalized in the definition of fiduciary duty in a way that it hasn't been, and that's done on a belief, not provable in a quantitative way, but based on a belief that there is a strong link.
I just wanted to ask you, what was the outcome of Greenpeace versus Nestle? Did they change their policy completely and publicly vis-a-vis palm oil?
Well, the two answers to the question. The first is, to extend the story a little bit, Nestle responded by basically saying Greenpeace was being unfair, and Greenpeace's response to that is life isn't fair, and an $80 billion company nestled in the Swiss Alps is not one to complain about whether life is fair. and Nestle is widely believed to have extended the controversy and scored an own goal in terms of taking that approach. So that's one bit. In terms of their practices, Nestle is an active part of a coalition called the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil, which is moderately successful, and they've redoubled their efforts. There are lots of other things going on. I think it probably had some marginal impact on Nestle's practices, but probably had the greatest impact on raising awareness in the public about this issue, which then has a greater impact on the overall effort to deal with the palm oil question.
I mean, they did promise to no longer procure palm oil from this one supplier who was implicated in clear cutting in an area where there was an orangutan habitat. I mean, it wasn't there. Nestle wasn't cutting down trees to do this. So there was at least that very binary promise made. Neither of us have followed up as to what's happened in the subsequent year.
Yes, I had the chance to skim your book, and I saw that you had mentioned that internal incentives for companies, motivating employees, was something of importance. But it's also, I've heard that that's one of the biggest barriers to having company success is transitioning their employees. Can you talk about that, or any other major barriers you see companies facing to transition to this new economy?
Incentives, if I could wave a magic wand, that's probably the one I would raise or wave, because this is what motivates and creates behavior inside companies. There is a move to, excuse me, to condition some executive compensation on sustainability performance in some companies, and I think that's a pretty powerful mechanism. It focuses the minds of the C-suite, and that tends to have some trickle-down effect, because when the CEO's pay is based on a certain level of performance, rest assured he or she is going to be very interested in making sure that the company follows through. So I think that's very important. We've talked about some barriers already. One I would speak to is customers, or consumers. I'm fairly cynical about what consumers say and do, and those two things are actually quite different. The survey after survey shows that consumers are willing to pay more for a product that is more environmentally sound, ethically produced, et cetera, et cetera. Very few companies believe that that's the case. They don't believe it because behavior at the cash register suggests otherwise. So that's a big barrier. Some companies are trying to break it down by helping consumers understand how they can save money by doing, by pursuing more sustainable products, and indeed that's often the case. We live in a disposable culture where we buy 10 units of something that will last a shorter period of time than 4 units of something that's better made and more sustainable. And so companies are trying to figure out ways to convey all of that. If that nut gets cracked, I think a lot of progress is made. But right now, I would say there are 7 billion barriers to a sustainable economy. It's the 7 billion people who buy, sell, and trade things every day.
Just one quick on that. You know, we do talk about Levi Strauss a lot in the book, and Levi is one of the greener companies around and has been, you know, innovative across the whole supply chain of cotton and how cotton is picked and jeans are dried. But I don't think a lot of consumers associate a purchase of Levi jeans as a green purchase. They've basically pursued these things in tandem, which is make great jeans that consumers want, cultivate your brand, and then also have all these efficiencies that have dramatic effects on the supply chain. And oddly enough, you could say the same thing about Walmart, from a very, very different corporate ethos, but heading toward a very similar corporate outcome.
First of all, thank you. I really identify with your outlook and your perhaps at times almost unwarranted optimism, but I think I totally identify with it. And it brought to mind something that happened in roughly, this is very rough, around the early 80s. The idea that people were important became kind of a good thing to know about, and then Peter Drucker wrote an article that talked about knowledge workers, and we began talking about intellectual capital. This is all the beginning of, this is the wind-up. But then there became a thing called human resources. It used to be called in the old days personnel management, no longer used. Human resources became a title, became then a department, and then it became, lo and behold, vice presidents for human resources, because of the recognition over the years of the significance of human capital in the effective organization. It just seems like yesterday, but it wasn't. It was maybe 30 or 40 years ago when this thing developed. And now on many corporate boards and many C offices, there is sometimes, almost always, a VP for human resources. Your sense of the future is that, let's say, within the next 5 to 10 years, maybe, we'll have in every successful global corporation, NGO, title of VP for sustainability?
So I'm going to tout Aron's horn here, because one of the things actually he's been saying repeatedly, both in connection with the book, but just very much in connection with
tired of hearing
work,
of it, but they're hearing it, but they're not.
Is this very idea that as human resources has become, I mean, it's interesting you raise this point because you've said exactly this, just as human resources has become a ubiquitous, clear aspect that is core to any company's excellence, that the directionality here is such that sustainability occupies the same ubiquitous space. Aron recently said at the BSR conference, the goal will be that everybody within the company is de facto the chief sustainability officer. Just like everybody or every department has to think about human resources, has to think about the people that they hire and how, and that you don't block that out as this separate ghettoized function as part of corporate governance and corporate excellence. It's simply like accounting, like supply chains, like human resources, and eventually the goal and the hope is that, like sustainability, it's simply part of how you conduct an excellent business. Again, we're not sure that it's going to get there in quite that way, but it's clear now, and just so you know, most large companies do in fact have either a chief sustainability officer, a VP of sustainability, or some title that suggests that.
I want to thank you, too, for bringing this title forward for us to listen to and converse about. But I have a quandary. I know that there's a big push for corporate to migrate to sustainable. I'm just curious how that works with utility companies who have infrastructure. They have healthcare costs, they have benefits, they have pension plans, and if they are not curtailing or modifying those costs, how do we maintain the gains in capital, resources that we look to, recover?
Well, it's really important, and one of the things that's interesting, if you look around at which companies and which CEOs have been the strongest advocates for action in Washington on climate change, it's the heads of a lot of the biggest utilities in the United States. Florida Light and Power, Edison, PG&E, Duke Energy, AEP, and it's precisely because the need to make these big capital expenditures means that the heads of these companies are placing bets that are going to pay off over decades. And they want to see action because they know what direction we're going in, and they want a degree of certainty so they can understand what level of investment to make and what kind of energy source. So it's, I think the question of human capital I'll come to in a second, but I think this is very telling because if you look at the companies that are most interested or that have to make long-term investments, they're the ones who are most vocal. There's a guy named Jim Rogers who runs a company called Duke Energy, and he's basically become an ambassador for legislative action on climate change. And he's very honest about it. He says, look, I believe in the environmental issues at play here, but I have to know what bets to place for my company, and if I don't know what the price on carbon is going to be, how do I know what kind of plants to build? So it's hugely, hugely important. And a topic that Zachary writes on, you may want to touch on this, is competitiveness across borders. And this was the big debate in Detroit that General Motors, which was known as Generous Motors, basically had a $1,500 per car burden because of the pension costs it was paying. Now this is a huge and difficult political issue because we've gone to global competition overnight, and you can't silo competition the way you silo pension plans. And so this is an issue that I think has to be elevated to the political sphere because there's a need, if we're going to step back from some of the commitments that have been made to people, it creates a safety net issue, and that's something that transcends an individual company. That's something that is a question of social policy, needs to be dealt with, and needs to be dealt with urgently, given the fact that, especially for utilities, they tend to operate in national environments, but there's global competition that affects all the questions that you're talking about.
I mean, it is an issue that they are grappling with, that the absence of government action is making it difficult for them to do so. I would suggest, though, that as it becomes clear that there is not going to be federal government action, the way in which many of these companies begin to grapple with these things will be different. I mean, that we had a kind of a crest of expectation that the United States would follow in Western Europe or the EU's path and set a price of carbon and there would be a system. Now that it's clear that that's not going to happen, but you do have myriad of state regulations, including very intensive ones coming out of California, that there's going to be a differentiation between how different companies respond to a marketplace where there is a de facto price. It's not always clear what that de facto price is. And there's a whole series of regulations about pollution and emissions and all of it, which create a de facto price. So I don't know what the outcome is going to be here, and it certainly would have been better for there to be some socially agreed upon clarity. But what's interesting about businesses is that really good businesses, in the absence of something they prefer, try to create a solution instead. And it'll be interesting to see what utilities do around this, because good ones are going to say, look, we have to deal with some of these issues, whether it's, labor or environment, and we have to deal with it constructively, or we will lose our social license to operate.
Yes, thank you. Congratulations first on your book. I think it's a good contribution to the literature. I'd like to kind of raise a challenge, if you will, because it seems to me that when you talk about sustainability, you also have to, at the same time, talk about solvency and scalability. So all three of those S words are crucial. If you look at electric drive technology, it's definitely sustainable, at least directionally. But if you look at what Bolivia does in terms of nationalization, if you look at rare earth metals obviously being embargoed by China, that is not scalable for 2 billion cars. If you look at biofuels, they're partially sustainable. But if you look at Russia's embargo of their grain, and have had that event in Moscow occurred in Chicago, 18 degrees, warmer than the norm, we would have lost 30% of U.S. grain and all of our exports, et cetera. So biofuels are not inherently scalable. The challenge really is not just to be able to ascertain what's sustainable, but how do you make it solvent and most particularly scalable? And so one, I'd urge you to your next so-called sequel to focus on that deeper challenge. And I guess the question I'd ask is, given how perceptive you are about global economics, would you agree with me that fundamentally the CO2 challenge is going to be completely defined by the trajectory that China is going to put the globe on in terms of CO2? I don't think there's really any challenge to that. And given that trajectory, which is inherently not sustainable, is it not true that the only way to get to sustainability is to figure out how to recycle the CO2 that will end up in the atmosphere? Because unless we figure out a way to recycle what's going to get there, there is no hope whatsoever of attaining what you would refer to as sustainability.
So on the word sustainable, there's a green architect named Bill McDonough who says sustainable is a terrible word, said if he gets asked how his relationship with his wife is, and he says it's sustainable, that's not a good thing. So I agree. I think the language is tricky. Look, the world has had a fairly unitary energy system for the last 125 years, and it's gotten us, we've gotten very comfortable relying on oil and coal primarily, and some gas and a little bit of nuclear, but the future has to be much more diverse. Now that's really complicated because you also need infrastructure that enables that. You need smart systems that enable switching things on and off. It's more complicated. But to get to the future, whatever adjective you want to use, whatever S word you want to use, certainly to scale though, we have to figure out a way to make a more diverse system work. And that's not simple. I don't have a magic bullet for that. As for China, I think history is seldom linear, and so yes, if we progress, if we project out and assume that China is going to continue to invest in the kind of coal-fired powered plants that it's building right now, then what one of my wife's cousins says is true. Who the hell cares what we do? China's going to fry us all. Well, I'm not sure I really believe that, because I don't think that's what China wants. China's trying to make a transition as well, and it arguably has more coherent policy on this than we have. I wouldn't necessarily say better, but I would say more coherent. And I'm just not convinced that the trajectory there is linear and follows what's happening today because of the investments that are being made in disruptive technologies.
Just a quick thing on this. China will get worse before it gets better. And so 5 years from now, we will be talking about China's impact, purely in terms of carbon emissions, as being a more deleterious one than we're talking about it today. And there's no question about that. It will be worse 10 years from now. The question is, will it be worse 20 years from now? And they at least are doing the kind of investment in an alternate pathway, recognizing that they are not likely to be able to support the car intensivity or any other replicable model of Western middle-class lifestyle in the same way without very quickly running up against the limitations of the natural resource supply chain, which they do not and cannot, no matter what they purchase of mines in Africa or resources in South America, control. So, I think this is a very long burn kind of picture. Maybe that's
No pun
not the right
intended, yeah.
analogy. But it's really what that sort of 10 to 20 year horizon looks like, because no doubt the next 10 years is going to be worse, and we should accept that and accept that that's the path that we are globally on. The question is, are there businesses that are mitigating against it and are innovating toward another future or not? And are there some governments and societies doing the same thing? And will that, on balance, lead to a more constructive future or a more destructive one? I mean, if you want to get really philosophical about it, human history has been an endless story of the desire to destroy, competing against the ability to create. And this is just our latest chapter of that. And what the outcome is, I don't know. I mean, we're here now, so we know that there's been at least a 51-49 split. But, I'm betting on that continuing. But there you have it. I mean, we'll see. Or someone will.
There's one in the far back. I don't know if you can
I have a
see.
question.
Oh, sorry, here's the mic.
Right.
Would you comment on the use of shale as an energy source?
Yeah. I'm not a big fan about the use of shale and shale gas as an energy source. It's a highly disruptive way of obtaining natural gas, of course mitigated by the fact that it's obtaining natural gas, right? It is certainly not as deleterious by any stretch of the imagination as the oil sands, which are neither sands nor really oil. They're just this kind of tarry amalgam that has to be broken down by lots of chemicals and huge amounts of excavation. But oddly enough, the discovery of huge shale gas resources in the United States has driven the price of natural gas incredibly low. It's in fact driven it so low that it's difficult for the companies that have exploited it to make money doing it. I mean, there's actually such a thing as energy prices getting too low when it comes to a more sustainable future. But this will not be an issue in Europe. There will be no shale gas exploration in Europe because it's way too environmentally disruptive of local and high-intensity communities. And so this is really an American and particularly North and Eastern American phenomenon.
Who do you see investing in the heavy-duty research and engineering that's really needed? I mean, there's a great deal of science research that you're talking about that may not have an immediate return, and somebody's got to be investing in that. It's long-term, it's high risk, it's multiple disruptive technologies coming together at once, and it's not just one technology that's going to be the silver bullet. So what organizations, or if not government, or what economic organizations do you see stepping forward to absorb the cost of doing the actual engineering and science development required for what you're talking about?
I'm thinking the Milken Institute. Anyone? Mike? Skip? Sorry.
Yeah. Well, we should let them respond.
We're open to proposals.
Yeah. There's a lot of investment taking place. So a lot of it's happening at university level. Some of it's sponsored by companies. Again, ironically enough, BP has been fostering a lot of investment working with the University of California and the University of Illinois, and some fruit may come from that. The clean tech space, of course, is very, very active and has continued to be active. And companies continue to invest in this, and some of it tied to their current businesses. And there's been a rise of internal venture funds inside a lot of different companies, ranging from Cargill to Nike to Unilever. They're all camping up in Silicon Valley, trying to find the next big thing and not leaving it to firms like Kleiner Perkins to do that. So there's a lot of activity going on. Is it enough? We won't know. I'm going to sound a little like George W. Bush. We won't know how history plays out till we're dead. I will make no further comment. But there is a lot going on. One of the interesting things to watch is ARPA-E in the federal government, and ARPA was basically the agency that created the internet, And ARPA-E is designed to look at renewable energy sources, and there's a lot of money and a lot of very, very smart people looking at a variety of things, some of which will pay off, most of which won't, but that's what high-risk, high-return investing does.
We're going to take one more question.
Do the companies that focus on sustainability also look to the longer term? One of the big problems in America has been the short-term outlook of companies, and quite different from the gentleman's experience with HR. I would say the primary function of HR today is to reduce employees and to destroy the intellectual capital. And it used to be that major companies were very concerned about their communities and their employees. Now they seem more concerned about the bottom line, and I wonder if this trend is spilling out into other places, such as Germany, which in this recession kept its people more, engaged than the American companies.
Well, I think it really depends on what industry one's talking about. So in the technology industry, broadly defined, particularly in California, it's true that many companies, including a company like HP, have reduced their internal research budgets. It's also true that they've essentially outsourced those research budgets toward sort of little companies funded by venture that are candidates for acquisition. Meaning it's a more complicated story of when an industry is thriving, which the U.S. technology industry still is, as both a source of innovation and a source of product creation globally. Not all companies need to do things as internally as they used to, and that's not just a function of trying to cut workers and focus on the bottom line. It's where are things done most effectively. Manufacturing, is also, it depends on which manufacturing industry you're in. Caterpillar has been investing a lot in, making more machines more effectively. I mean, whether or not Caterpillar is an exemplar of sustainability, given what it actually does, is a whole other issue. So, you ask, it's hard to answer that question in a compressed way, right? But there are certainly a lot of trends in the American economy that are disruptive. Some of those are brought on by corporations, some of those are brought on by technology, some of those are brought on by globalization, and we have a whole host of issues about employment. And we could certainly write an addendum to the book that we wrote that acknowledges the degree to which some sustainability strategies, just like some efficiencies and technology strategies, are disruptive of employment. But there is no such thing, I think, as change that is without disruption.
I think short-term thinking is one of the biggest problems we have in the economy, and I think it's without, without changing that through a whole variety of means, I think that it's not that there won't be progress, but it is that the progress will be sharply limited. So I think it's a huge issue.
Gentlemen, thank you so much.
Thank you.
This has been very wonderful.
So we will.
Please, the book is for sale over here in the corner, and just go ahead and line up right over here where they'll sign their books.
And it's very important to sustain the American publishing industry. So buy books.